Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by Women's Place UK with Helen Joyce. We're here to launch Helen Joyce's book, Trans, which I've got here. Hope you can see that, which is published on Thursday. If you haven't already got a copy, I hope you can get it from your local bookshop. But I think Blackwells also have lots of signed copies and also do free postage. I'm really honoured and pleased to have been asked by Women's Place UK to interview Helen about her book this evening. We've got about an hour, so I'm going to talk to Helen for about 3/4 of that, and then there'll be time for some questions at the end. Thanks so much for coming. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And if you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is WPUK Reality. So Helen.
Hi.
Hello. Lots of the feminist women writing on this subject are feminist campaigners of various sorts. You're a journalist and not one, as far as I know, with a specialism in writing about women and women's rights. Can you tell us why you decided, or perhaps why and when you decided that this was a subject that you wanted to explore for what I think is your first book?
Yes, it's my first book. I decided that I'd go for something simple and non-controversial to ease me into the whole process of writing books. So I've worked at The Economist since 2005, and I've done a lot of different jobs there. I was hired as the education correspondent, and then I went out to Brazil in 2010 to be the Brazil correspondent. And when I came back, I took the job of international editor, which is editing a 2 or 3 page section of the paper, which does a different theme each week. And in one fateful week in, I think, 2017, the editor was sitting next to me at lunch on one day, and she sort of said, "Do you know why my kids keep coming home from school and saying such and such is non-binary?" I was like, no idea. I'll find out, shall I? And that was the start of the sort of adventure. I wrote a piece then that I look back on now, and I think it was sort of like 70 or 80% there. But I knew that I hadn't nailed it. There was something strange happening, and I hadn't managed to get my head around it. And I was also aware by then that other people didn't behave the same way around this topic as they do about other things. In particular, journalists don't. So journalists don't normally be so deferential to the people that they're writing about. Like, normally your first duty is to the reader rather than the person you're writing about. Like, you don't want to be messing people around. I'm not saying you do, but you're thinking about the reader more. And this particular topic was written about in this strange way where there was a very insider language, and, you know, saying to somebody, well, I don't understand what you're talking about, show that you're a bigot rather than the other person hadn't explained it properly. And I just kept pushing on, really. And then I tried to write another article about it, and that got quite serious pushback in various places. And that was when I realized I really was onto a strange story, and became quite obsessed and started looking at everything I could find about it. And as you say, I'm not a specialist in women's rights or the history of the women's movement or anything like that. But, you know, there's an awful lot of rubbish out there as well as good stuff. So obviously there's great things and there's fantastic women I don't know about. But there's also some appallingly weak and tragically awful work that I haven't been force-fed by having to study queer theory or gender studies or things like that. So in some ways, I think it was actually a blessing not having come in from that side of things.
You've got a maths, you're trained in maths, I think.
Yes, I did a PhD in mathematics. I think I got it in, 1995 or something. But I mean, you know, I could probably state the central theorem of the thesis, but I mean, I couldn't prove it for you or anything like that anymore. So I haven't used that for a long time. I stopped trying to be an academic sometime around 1999.
Quite a lot's been written about gender critical feminism in the UK, sometimes called Turf Island. But although you live here, you're not British, you're Irish. And I just was curious as to whether your experience of sort of sexual politics in Ireland has shaped your perspective.
I mean, maybe. I don't know so much of sexual politics. I mean, I'm 53 next week. I think that's right, yes. So I'm old enough that I left Ireland first when I was 17 and then again for good in my early 20s. So I'd already left before the scandals really started to break in the Catholic Church. You know, I knew there were very bad things happening. Everybody did, but you didn't talk about it. I'd say the thing that has shaped me more from my early life was the experience of accepting a faith unquestioningly and then losing it quite painfully. So as a teenager, you know, I from first principles decided I didn't believe anymore. And this was before large numbers of Irish people decided something similar on the basis of the way the Catholic Church behaved. And that was something that bothered me a lot. Like, I spent a lot of time trying to think about it and try to work out, you know, could I continue to believe? Was this wrong? Why did I believe? Why did other people believe? And so I've had that experience of believing a faith-based worldview and abandoning it, and abandoning the people and the place that I thought I belonged to. So when this came along, I mean, maybe the parallel isn't obvious to other people, but you know, if you are somebody who thinks of yourself as a liberal, and, you know, I mean, I'm not politically aligned, but, you know, put it this way, I'm not a Trumpite, let's just put it that way. If you think of yourself as being sort of the other side of politics, it's quite hard to accept that you're putting yourself outside the pale with your beliefs or your refusal to believe. And I think it helped that I already had that experience.
You say near the start of the book very clearly that it's not a book about people. It's a history of an idea, and then in its later stages, the history of two campaigns. For feminists like you and me also, it feels really important to understand the idea of gender identity, and particularly how it impacts on women and girls. But obviously for trans people, it's more than an idea. It's closely bound up in their personal identity, or for many trans people. I know there are also some gender critical trans people. I suppose, I'm sure you recognise that for some people, the attempts to kind of criticise or historicise the idea of trans or gender identity feels like a sort of personal affront, really, and a challenge to identity. I wonder if you could say something about that.
I mean, again, there's just no other subject that we would accept that limitation on what we do as journalists. I mean, I have a substantive answer to it, but I also just have that straightforward answer that, you know, journalists are meant to pick their pens up and go and ask people questions. They're not meant to have sacred cows. They're not meant to worry too much about, you know, how this feels to the person they're talking to. I mean, you don't seek to be rude, but you don't tread lightly and then not get the answers that you need to inform your audience. So there's that, there's just the moral imperative of doing journalism. But there's also, I mean, the obvious analogy is again with religion. You know, I work with people around me all the time who are Catholic, who are Jewish, who are atheists like me, many other things too. And I mean, they know I don't believe a word of it. You know, it's not a challenge to my Roman Catholic colleagues that I do not believe that either they or I have an immortal soul. I do not believe that they or I were saved by, you know, the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, our Saviour. And I don't feel it as a challenge to me that they do believe that both of us have a soul and that both of us were saved by Jesus. We live in a pluralistic society and people have different ways of understanding this world and themselves. And I feel no obligation whatsoever to accept somebody else's worldview or somebody else's conception of themselves. I don't want to go out of my way to rub their faces in something, but I just dissent. It's that simple.
But when you're choosing to write about someone else's worldview, do you think that has to be approached in a particular way?
I think to the best extent possible, we should seek to do all our work in the same way as journalists. I think this topic has suffered really hugely by people treating it differently from other topics. I think we shouldn't go out of our way to be insulting, but we also shouldn't go out of our way to adopt other people's language, or in particular, by the way, when that language impacts on us too. I mean, when we talk about gender identity, it isn't just trans people who claim a gender identity. They claim that everyone has a gender identity. So in that sense, it is very comparable to a soul. And if somebody else says that I've got a soul, I feel quite entitled to say, no, I don't. And by the way, you don't either. So I really mean it that I'm not writing about trans people. I'm writing about a worldview or an idea that seeks to explain all of humanity, every person, that says everybody has this thing. And you know, the people who have been unable to speak about the consequences of this idea, the people who have been really silenced, are those female people who do not see this idea of gender identity as a particularly helpful or explanatory idea in understanding themselves, do not repudiate their sex, do think that their sex is consequential for their lives. That's pretty near to a majority of all human beings, because that's most women and we're a majority. So a majority nearly of human beings, their viewpoint has been silenced on this. I make no apology for representing that opinion. Other people can represent other opinions, but I'm representing that viewpoint and I'm saying how it looks from that place.
And so you trace the history of the idea of gender identity back to sort of early gender medicine. The doctor who operated on Lily Elbe, the Danish girl, which some audience members may have seen, in Germany in the 1930s, and then in the US, sort of from the 50s onwards. Is it not arguable that trans has a longer history and a sort of wider geography than this? Gender nonconformity certainly has a long history, and third genders, which you mention in the book, do appear in various cultures. I suppose I'm just wondering if people may not have called themselves transsexual before the 1970s or transgender before the 90s, but obviously cross-sex identifications of various kinds go back a long way.
So yes, they do. And I think the idea or the feeling that one is not of one sex is something that does seem to come up spontaneously in very rare cases in many cultures. It's highly, highly bound up with being same-sex attracted. So most of the people who have been accommodated, historically speaking, in different places in the world, you know, in Oaxaca, the Muxés, in the Hijra of India, the Fa'afafine and Samoa, all of these people, these were all ways of accommodating effeminate same-sex attracted men in a hierarchical, patriarchal society where men were men and same-sex attracted men couldn't be allowed to sully manhood. And so a third category was found for these people, and they weren't seen as either men or women, still really unambiguously male. It was understood what part they would play in reproduction if they were to reproduce, but they were not men or women. So yes, there is a history of ways of accommodating people who seem unable to be fitted into the sex binary, in the way that it plays out in society. By the way, they're not very interested usually in fitting women who don't want to fit into the sex binary as it plays out in society, because most women would like to opt out of, you know, being beaten by their husbands or married off by their brothers or, you know, raped within marriage or any of those things. Those sorts of opting out were never allowed. It's only men who want to sleep with men who are allowed to opt out, and only in some cultures. So do you want to call that trans? I mean, then you just come to a question of semantics, really. I don't think it makes any more sense to call Fa'afafine trans than it makes to call trans people Fa'afafine. Like, we don't, you know, if someone were to say there have always been Fa'afafine, it would make no sense. We have no Fa'afafine here. It's a culturally specific thing. So I think trans is likewise culturally specific. It's a modern and really recent way of understanding the phenomenon of people who want to identify out of their sex. And then the one more thing I would say about this is the phenomenon of wanting to identify out of your sex. It isn't a static thing. It isn't a thing that people are born with the way they're born with cystic fibrosis. It's not like there's a certain incidence of it in a society that is unchanged by anything that happens in that society. It is largely created by the society. So if you've got someone who's highly gender non-conforming in early childhood, and that person is given to understand, let's say it's a little boy, they're given to understand at 2 or 3 or 4 that the way they want to behave and the people they want to hang around with and the way they move and the way they want to dress and the activities they're attracted to, that all these things make them horrible, horrific, despicable little people who don't even deserve to be men, you know, well, you start to think there's something wrong with me, and you start to be uncomfortable with your sex. Whereas in a more accommodating culture, you wouldn't experience gender dysphoria. The Fa'afafine do not typically experience gender dysphoria at all. They're not unhappy with their sex bodies. They just know that they want to live in this third role that's neither the men's role nor the women's role. So gender dysphoria is something that's created largely by society. And trans, as I write about in the book, is an idea about what all of us have inside us, what it means to be a man or a woman or something else. It's a highly, you know, specific, culturally specific, recent idea. So to historicize that, I think you would first have to start by accepting just how special and strange that conception is. And you would straight away have to say, well, previously people who were gender non-conforming or didn't identify with their sex didn't see it this way. But that's a step too far for the current ideologues, because they do believe that we all have this strange sort of sexed soul.
I was thinking about all this sort of in advance of this evening, and I was just wondering whether you think that if feminists or some feminists are guilty of trying to hold trans or LGBTQ activists to a sort of higher standard, a more precise standard than we collectively have kept to ourselves. I was thinking about the way that thinking of feminist literary criticism, say, lots of sort of women writers, dating back centuries, have been kind of roped into sort of feminist literary criticism, when I think the etymology of the term feminist is kind of late 19th century France, but people sort of wouldn't think twice about describing George Eliot, or, was Jane Austen a feminist, or was Queen Elizabeth I? And I just wonder if there's a bit of sort of pot calling kettles black in as much as, I mean, my instinct is to absolutely agree with you that it's very important to be sort of accurate and specific about ideas and where they come from and when they come from. But I suppose I've just been looking at trying to be a bit more self-critical and sort of thinking, well, have feminists always done that? And thinking maybe not.
Yeah, I really do see what you're saying. I mean, I suppose here it's one of the times that I can be quite grateful that I wasn't in any sense a professional feminist. I mean, I called myself a feminist, but I just meant from my teens that I believed that men were as good as women, and that, societal arrangements like that it was not possible to rape your wife, were very bad. I didn't mean anything more worked out than that. So I recuse myself from this particular criticism. But apart from that, I was thinking about this too. And I mean, one of the words that I knew but hadn't had occasion to use before I wrote the book, which I've been thinking about a lot since, is reify. To reify something is to make an abstract thing concrete. And once you take an abstract thing like a gender identity, or indeed like a feminist, and you make it a concrete thing, and then you call something that, you've changed the way that you think about that thing. So if you didn't really have an idea of feminism or what a feminist meant, and you thought about George Eliot, or you thought about, Millicent Fawcett or somebody, you would say they were fighting for women's rights, or, they were very brave, or they were looking to end a particular injustice. But when you call them a feminist, you then look at them and say, well, of course, today they would have agreed with everything that we say. They would have been, pro reproductive rights or something. So because you've created this category, you imagine that people from the past are put into it. So I think maybe that would be the fairer way of answering your question about, have there always been trans people? Like, if we don't reify being trans, and we don't reify gender identity, and we just say, there's this strange phenomenon that some people just feel they fit much better in the other category. Yeah, that does happen. That has always happened. My issue in the book is really with the specific idea, and that's not just because I'm nitpicking. It's because we now live in a very codified world where things are written down in laws and in policies, and things are defined in those as well. So when we say gender identity is something that's protected in law, we've reified this idea for the first time. And that has consequences for who goes in what prisons, who plays in what sports, what children are taught, whether children are put on particular medical pathways. And all of that is quite new. Even if someone 150 years ago, or if I go back a bit less far to Lily Elbe, the Danish girl, like Lily Elbe was Andreas Wegener, a man who believed he had a woman inside, and he called this woman Lily, and he felt that he had to bring her into being, and the only way she could be brought into being was to destroy Andreas. So that was an idea he came to pretty much all on his own. And that's an idea that's handed on a plate now to kids. But it's an idea he did have on his own, so you could call him an early trans person, sure. But I don't think he believed something that's the fully worked out thing that we're protecting in law, gender identity.
I mean, I suppose I'm curious as to whether some of the divisions that we see now between sort of feminists who have very different ideas about the significance of sex, gender identity, if this sort of argument has forced a lot of divisions into the open, and in a sense that we're just kind of papered over, or people weren't specific enough about, and feminism was just this rather loose kind of a bit sort of anything goes. And it's just recently I've been thinking and really interested in thinking about differences in particularly second wave feminism between radical and socialist feminists, obviously on the left, but also feminist history going back much further in the sort of early part of the 20th century. And I don't know, I wonder if you could say a bit more about your own feminism. You just said it sort of almost very light, wore it very lightly as a teenager. Were there any influences on you, or does it really feel it was a sort of organic, sort of ordinary political consciousness in the late 21st century?
I read a lot as a teenager, and I read a lot of feminism as a teenager, Simone de Beauvoir and Germaine Greer, and sort of a lot of second wave feminism. And then, my life just took a different path. I did mathematics, I went on, I did a PhD, I was an academic for a while, I tried various different things. I went to a workplace which is a very male dominated workplace and always had been, and was just starting to have more women working there. And, I would always have said I was a feminist because just that sort of, I forget who it was who said, any woman who says she isn't a feminist is just an idiot. I forget, there's some pop singer or someone who said something like this. Of course you're a feminist, you're working for yourself, but it wasn't massively theorized. And I would say it still isn't. And to the extent that it wasn't, I have been very uncomfortable for a long time with the reality denying strand in feminism. I mean, there are several, and now there's this more recent one, but before that there was the sex, there are no differences between the sexes, that reality denial within feminism. And I mean, Kathleen Stock talks about this in her book, and my book is a different book.
Abolition, sort of gender abolitionist, or
gender abolition, but also this strange unspoken belief that yes, you accept evolution and you recognize that evolution happens below the neck, but you don't seem to think that it happens above the neck. Well, that's just ridiculous. Like, if I have anything that I could count as a religion, it's evolution. And there's an analogy I've used before because I work with a lot of economists, and they do have very good sayings. There's a joke about economists. An economist is somebody who walks past a dollar bill on the sidewalk and doesn't pick it up. And another economist says, why didn't you pick it up? And the first economist says, well, there's no free money. There can't be a dollar on the sidewalk. So evolution doesn't leave dollars on the sidewalk. If there's anything that can be done within the space of possible adaptations to an environment, evolution has already done it. It is just not possible that human females and human males are the only mammals in which the females and the males are absolutely identical in their interests, their abilities, their tastes, any of those things. It's just not possible. And yet most of the feminism that I found acts as if to say that makes you not feminist. And so now has come along this strange movement which has us denying the bodily realities too. And suddenly the same people who would go to the wire to say that there are no mental differences whatsoever between men and women are suddenly all on, 50% greater body strength and 10% faster running speed. And, did you know the hip angle is less conducive to running? And, come on, like, if there's all those physical differences, there's probably mental differences too. And to me, the lesson of Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, wasn't that men and women have to be the same to be equal. It's that if you pretend that men and women are the same, it's the women who lose out, because this world is designed for men. So you have to recognize, and I know this is called difference feminism, but I feel it needs a refounding because the world is different and we're different than the difference feminism of, I think, the 1970s. So I see this as a wonderful opportunity to start in many ways afresh. Of course, not throwing out what's been before. Feminism suffers from that horribly, like constantly forgetting what our foremothers did and starting again. I just mean we've now been given this incredible motive force by this bizarre movement to say, no, what are we? What is it to be female? What is it to be female in this world? What is female embodiment? What do we need? How does the world need to adapt to us as women?
I'm going to ask you a bit more about evolution in a minute. But I wanted to just ask you about why you think that gender critical feminism in the UK is how it is. Your book, just to tell people who haven't had the chance to read it yet, I mean, it describes the campaign really to sort of superimpose gender identity, to sort of substitute it as on top of sex as the sort of main way in which people are categorized and thought about. And then the book also describes the sort of campaign that sprung up to sort of resist that first movement. So it's a sort of book about two different sort of rival movements that are still, as we know, sort of slugging it out, really. But lots of not very good things, I think, have been, not very insightful things have been written about the UK. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about why gender critical feminism here is how it is.
So the first thing you have to understand is that this gender identity idea is an American creation. It's a creation of the American left. It's as culturally specific as the idea of Fafafine or Mouche. And it was created basically on American campuses in certain disciplines, and it was exported from there. And there's never been any country or any idea, like any group that have been as dominant as American leftists in the world until now. So if you think about, and it really is the left of America. It's not Republicans who spread their ideas across the world. They spread hard power, but the soft power comes from the left. So if you look at Hollywood, if you look at the mainstream media, if you look at social media, the tech firms, and all university ideas, all of these things spread out from America. And this idea was born there. So it spread. Well, it obviously goes to the places that are culturally closest, fastest, and that's the Anglosphere. So Canada is basically kind of like a left-wing America without a right-wing America. So obviously Canada just fell straight away. It hasn't even got Republicans to say, not having any of this, thanks. And then the next nearest is the UK. But the UK is a bit further away, and it has a very different tradition of feminism to American feminism. I mean, British feminism or English feminism, I don't know which best to describe it as, is much more materialist. It was very focused on, through trades unions, thinking about maternity rights, thinking about reproductive rights. Very, very good organizers. And I think you see this with WPUK, actually. It's obvious that the people who set this movement up are people who came up through the union movement. They're excellent organizers, the sort of people who can turn up at council meetings week after week and year after year, and party members, So there was this very different sort of feminism that was a way to resist this movement, but not in a polarized way. So in America, half of America doesn't agree with it, but this is the half of America that doesn't talk to the other half of America. Like, each side regards the other side's beliefs as proof that those ideas are wrong. They're not listening to each other at all. It's not like Democrats in America are listening to Republican critiques of gender identity ideology and taking them on board. They're hearing them and saying, that's bigotry. That's the sort of thing that Trumpites believe. Therefore, I'm right, and vice versa. Whereas here you've got people in the same party, in the Labour Party. You've got people who even founded Stonewall together, who are split. I mean, I don't know if it's exactly half and half, but it's not far off. Those people who actually, fought on the barricades together pretty much in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Some of them don't even speak to each other anymore on this issue. And that just shows you how it's people in the same intellectual movement who disagree on this. And that's why there's a fight. And if you go further away culturally again, so say you go to Northern Europe, to Finland and Sweden, they did import some of these ideas. They did start treating children in these very ideologically driven ways with puberty blockers and with cross-sex hormones. But they're stopping now because they're not so culturally close. So it didn't infiltrate as much. So what you're seeing in the UK is the exact right combination for a really house-to-house fight to the death. And that's why it looks like we're the ones who are standing up to it. Other places either fell without a fight, like Canada, or are going to shrug it off fairly easily, like I would have thought Northern Europe and further afield as well. Here, this is a fight for the soul of the left, and not just left, liberal as well.
So at the front of your book are two quotes. Shall I read them?
Yeah, go on.
Do you want to read them?
Oh, all right.
Go
I've got my book here, yeah. Can I just say to everybody, I did send one of my copies to J.K. Rowling yesterday, so I'm running down my 10 author copies. So the first one's from Audre Lorde, and it's, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether or not I am afraid." And the second one is George Orwell, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows."
So I was really struck by this combination, sort of Black American radical feminist and sort of Orwell, the kind of English liberal, anti-totalitarian. And I thought this contrast was a kind of neat reflection of where a lot of UK feminists have sort of ended up at the moment. I think this sort of gender critical feminism represents a really interesting coming together of really quite different political traditions. I can't imagine sort of Audre Lorde and George Orwell feeling like sort of natural book fellows in many other contexts. And I think it's also it's been quite disorienting politically, I think, the last few years. I guess I would have a slightly different take on whether, in terms of America, whether these ideas are really coming from what I would describe as the left. But anyway, that's perhaps another story. But I just wanted to ask you about free speech, which obviously is what the Orwell sort of speaks to. I think Rosie Duffield said in Parliament yesterday that academic freedom is a feminist issue.
Yes.
I mean, free speech, I mean, obviously everything can be a feminist issue, but free speech was never very sort of high up my list of things that I thought feminists need to worry about. I mean, have you long thought that free speech was an important problem or challenge for feminists?
I've always thought it was extremely important, but I never thought that it was an important, specifically feminist issue. And I'm not sure I still do think that. I think it's the thing that all else follows. That's what I like about that quote. Well, I like everything about that quote. I like the fact that it's not the freedom to say, as everyone insists on saying in things like Maya Forstatter's ruling, you know, oh, the freedom to say things even if they're offensive, even if they're stupid. No, she's just saying 2 + 2 = 4, for goodness sake. It's the freedom to say the truth that you see in front of your eyes, the palpable material reality that you see in front of your eyes. That's the most important. Somebody has just asked, can you repeat the quote? And I'm not meant to be looking at the chat, but I will. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 4. If that is granted, all else follows. So I have always really, that sort of thing has really resonated with me. And it's a foundational value for absolutely everything else, free speech. Because it is just so human to make mistakes all the time. We all get into our own silos. We all get into our own bubbles. We have, stupid ideas more on our own. We know human beings are not meant to be on their own. And more than that, we're tribal as well. We're very prone to believing what our tribe believes. Because if you are a small group of hunter-gatherers, 100, 150 people moving around in the rainforest, it's a bit irrelevant whether or not you're right about what makes the sun go around the earth as they thought it did. What matters is the cohesion of the group. So we're prone both to going into spirals on our own, and we're prone to tribal beliefs. So free speech is not something that's used very often. Not many people are going to say unpalatable truths. We get the idea that they do now because there's a lot of noise on social media, but actually what we're missing is that a lot of the noise on social media is people saying things that their tribe think is fantastic, but that we don't agree. Actually, most of the people who are speaking on social media are speaking in their tribe to their tribe. And that's true everywhere. So there's very few people who can stand up in a group of people they care about, people they feel affinity with, people they share foundational values with, and say, I think you're wrong. And those people are precious, and that thing is very precious. That's the thing that, would have stopped the Challenger disaster. It's the thing that stops medical malpractice. It's the thing that stops scientific malpractice. And right now, there are things happening because people aren't able to speak, really bad things. I think particularly about childhood transitioning. Like, there really are a lot of doctors, I hear from them, who know this is wrong, but don't know any way to say it. They know that if they say it, they'll just get sidelined and kicked out. I mean, we're seeing, an actual employment tribunal hearing about this at the moment. So if you want to live in a large, complex, pluralistic society that does difficult things like modern medicine and modern science and tries to send people to the moon and tries to plan welfare states and all these complex technocratic things that we do, you need to do everything you can to protect people who speak, the people who say the annoying things, the people who say, but have you thought of this? And we're doing the opposite at the moment. We're saying that those people are bigots, like they're always thought of as troublemakers, but we're adding to that they're bigots as well. And so for anybody who just wants things to be done well, but in particular those who do not see themselves as aligned with whatever the dominant groupthink is in their group, free speech is just foundational. So right now that's feminists. In another time it might be another group. But right now, yes, people who think that the material reality of female embodiment matters are highly countercultural. And so we're the people who need free speech right now. We need it really badly.
Thank you. You mentioned evolution a little while ago, and your view that gender identity, as it is sort of widely understood now, is not really compatible with evolutionary theory, because natural and sexual selection pressures acted on whole humans, not just, as you said, from the neck down. But obviously, gender medicine is full of doctors and people are trained in science. I just wonder if you could say something about how you think it's come to be that there's this branch of medicine that has taken this view of human beings that does seem difficult to reconcile with a sort of, I mean, I'm not trained in biology, but a fairly sort of basic
Yeah, you don't have to be trained in biology.
Understanding of evolution and how it works. Worked.
I mean, to me, it seems extraordinary. I can't give you a blow-by-blow description of how it happened. All I can do is say that this happens in medicine all the time. The buggers are forever getting mad ideas into their heads. And they get mad ideas into their heads about women in particular. So one of the things I did for the book was read several books about the history of psychic contagions, or what is it called? Somatizing. So lots of illnesses aren't things like, cystic fibrosis. They're things like, in hysteria in a past time, or ME, or long COVID, that are obviously a mixture of physical things, mental things, and these things are shaped into a syndrome when you go to visit the doctor. You and the doctor together talk through how you feel. And it's not just that they're describing what you're experiencing, they're shaping what you're experiencing too. It's very hard to see it in your own culture because it's happening all around you and you believe the things that are in your own culture. But when you look at another culture and you see that there are people who believe that they're made of glass, or that, a man who is disrespected, his genitals, scoop up into his body and then finally disappear, or you go to Charcot and you see that he created hysteria in the women, you realize to what extent doctors actually create and shape illness as well as just diagnose and treat it. And so if you look back through the history of the last couple of centuries of modern-ish medicine, very, very often they're doing this to women, and they see the problem as being the women's reproductive systems. Like the extraordinary range of things that doctors have cut women's ovaries and uteruses out for, unbelievable. So why are we surprised? They're doing it again. Again, women come in and say, sort of a general misery, unease, sense of wrongness in the world, a sense that the world is wrong, that they don't fit into it, that they aren't who they were meant to be. Women have been saying this for a long time to doctors in different ways. And it's shaped into hysteria, or it's shaped into reflex theory, or it's shaped in now, it was shaped into multiple personality disorder in the 1990s, and now it's being shaped into the idea that you're really a boy or you're really non-binary. And if you cut your breasts off, and by the way, we can take your ovaries and uterus out too, if you like, it'll make you better. So, none of this makes any sense to me, but they've been doing it for 2 centuries. So I can't be surprised this time either.
I guess, long COVID is so new that it's, they're still finding out, aren't they? But
yeah, but it's definitely going to be shaped by doctors partly. This is not me saying it's not real. And it's not me saying it hasn't got a biological basis to it, but the way that the doctor and you shape it together into what precisely those symptoms are, we're going to do that societally together over the next several years.
I wonder if you agree that, one of the things that's going on at the moment is a sort of contest between different ways of understanding ourselves, between a sort of idea that's really, although we've just been talking about the role of doctors, has strongly been shaped by ideas from the humanities, from philosophy, sort of post-structuralist, starting with perhaps with Foucault, French philosophy, and then in the influence of American sort of humanities departments, and then a different way of understanding ourselves, which is sort of biology, basically. Do you think that's one of the things that is happening at the moment, a sort of contest over how we do understand ourselves?
Yeah, and not very surprising, is it really? When I'm sitting looking at my computer at you. I've met you once in real life, I think, and since then it's been in a screen, and we've all spent the last 16 months staring at each other in screens. But young people in particular have been interacting like this for a bit longer, and they feel quite disembodied. They identify with their avatars. Some of them feel more comfortable living online, and that's just one of the ways in which the way that people understand themselves to be is changing. And, you know, we've never really liked the idea that we are just mammals, that we are creatures who are born and will die and the world will go on, and it will go on for incomprehensibly vast amounts of time. Like we're just this little tiny flash and on for millions and trillions of years without us. Of course, we think of ourselves as something more than that. You know, we think of ourselves as masters of the universe, or God's special creation, or what we feel ourselves to be. I mean, we all feel ourselves to be something behind the eyes carried around by a vessel. I do wonder, I often wonder if people felt like that before writing and reading. Like, were we so visual before that? But anyway, we all do now. We all think of ourselves as here, somewhere in behind here. And so when someone says to you, that self can be a different sex to this, and this is something that we can rework, like Mary Harrington is very good on this. She talks about, you know, the meat Lego that you can change. You know, you're the meat sack with this homunculus behind your eyes. I think that's the up and coming idea. I don't even know if that comes from Foucault or if it was created by the internet, or if it's something that was just there that we always felt that was just ready to be seized on by modern life, when we're so dissociated from our bodies and so dissociated from nature. And many of us never touch other people, don't touch animals, don't touch plants, just read and look. Sorry, I'm now rambling on the subject of how I feel that we're all turning into just meat sacks with a homunculus driving us from behind the eyes. That's the
really return of a sort of mind-body split.
Yeah, I mean, it is the most Cartesian dualist movement imaginable. It's actually a very babyish sort of, you know, childish, immature Cartesian dualism at the heart of gender identity ideology. But it's not surprising that some of the people who write about it are also transhumanists. You know, they really do see this as something that we can get rid of, and we can just upload ourselves into something else. And if you can see the connection between that and thinking that this could be a different sex to this.
Yeah, I guess I think, you know, obviously there's a lot of distress and emotional pain that goes with that sense of disconnection as well. So one wants to also to acknowledge that.
Yes, you know,
the idea, and then there's the, you know, the experience, which obviously can be excruciating.
But I think that's both created and expressed. I think it's important not to ever talk about gender dysphoria as this, like that there's a certain quantum of gender dysphoria in the world, and it's expressed in different ways or treated in different ways or treated better or worse. We also create gender dysphoria. And sometimes we create it in people who weren't even that massively distressed. Of course, sometimes there are people who are extremely distressed and would have done other very painful things like cutting or starving to express that distress, but now they express it in gender dysphoria. But we are also creating it. You know, when you tell people, as school materials now do, you know, when you tell people that what makes you a boy or a girl is how closely you feel you fit to these extraordinarily tight stereotypes, you're creating gender dysphoria, you're creating misery, just as you are when you show girls, you know, unrealistically thin bodies and tell them that nobody doesn't look like this is ever going to find a boyfriend. You know, it's not like there's just this certain amount of anorexia out there. We know that you can create it.
So looking at the US, as you know, as much as one can from afar, it seems like it's difficult, if not impossible, there really for feminists or women to find a space between sort of sexism on the one hand, sort of, which is associated with the conservative right, you know, the wish to control women's reproductive lives, you know, linked to sort of much older ideas, really, that reproduction is women's most important role and that they perhaps shouldn't be doing much else. And then this much newer idea, which of sort of sex denialism, really, that sex isn't important at all. From my point of view, the path that feminism needs to find is between those two things. Do you think that British feminists are managing it?
I mean, we'll be able to write that book in 50 years, won't we? When you and I are really old, let's write that book together. I mean, this mug, a few people have commented on it. So it's this nice suffragette mug, but what it says here on the purple bar is same shit, different century. And so it does seem to me, same shit, different century. Like, is it really that very different to say that a woman is somebody who should regard herself as dedicated to her role as a baby making machine, or to say that if you feel that you are dedicated to the stereotypes of femininity, that's what makes you a woman? I mean, those two ideas seem to me to just be the flip side of the same coin. Like the idea that, yes, I'm a female mammal, I have something in common with other female mammals that I don't have in common with any male mammal. That thing has shaped my life. I was infertile. When we did IVF, I was thinking about this today because I was thinking of one of the surpassingly stupid academics who writes things about this in this country, who says things like, so you think that because a woman is infertile, she's less womanly. Well, you know what? When I went along to the fertility clinic with my husband, they didn't ask which of the two of you are we going to take the eggs from and which one of you is giving a sperm sample. They knew that. So my life has been shaped by being female. It's been shaped by having to being the person who bore the costs of the fertility treatment, of the pregnancies, of the breastfeeding, of all of those things. But I don't regard that as limiting. Those were things that I did with my one and only embodied life. If I'd been a male, I would have done different things, that's all. And, we've been given this really precious chance to step away from these pre-cooked narratives that I think a lot of them do come from men, because this world has been created by men, and we can start again and say, who do we want to be? And of course, many women have done this over the past couple of centuries in different ways. And I think we can go back and look at what they've written too. Yeah, it feels like an opportunity, doesn't it, to you, that it's an opportunity to re-examine things that you thought you knew, that like I felt a lot more certain about lots of things 10 years or even 5 years ago than I do now, but I'm finding that liberating.
That's good to hear. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it made me think hard. I suppose that's good, but I also worry that it's a drain of sort of energy and resources that could be. Anyway, I'll move on.
No, I agree with you on that. I mean, the time that we spend explaining to people that humans aren't clownfish, that's time wasted. But the bit where we think, like, what is it to be a woman? What can a woman be? That's not wasted. That's never wasted.
So I've got one more question, and then we'll have some questions. I wish we could sort of see you all. It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, it is funny. But I'm seeing, I love this as an opportunity. I like her mug. That's nice.
So I'm really glad, as I think you know, that discussions like this are taking place and books like yours are being published. I think you've been very brave to write it, and it's really useful and important that that writers like you are making an effort to explain what's going on to a wider public. But I also think there's a need for discussions with LGBTQ activists and trans people and writers. I said to you before that I hope somebody might put on an event similar to this that might sort of pair you up with a trans author, because some form of kind of compromise or mutual understanding seems like the only way forward in the end. I just wondered if you have any thoughts about how this might come about.
So right from the start of trying to write about this, I have tried to do that, and other people have tried to do it. I've been contacted many times by people who naively turn up and go, oh, this is really interesting. Let's do a debate. Let's do an event. And I say, sure, that's fine. I'm happy to, but go and find the other person first. Don't waste your time trying to work out when I'm free. And then they never come back to me because they're never able to get the other person. Now, I really understand that for an individual trans person, that might feel it's just too personal. Like, you don't want the whole weight of this ideology and the whole weight of defending, what is a very broad church on you. But can I just say, by the way, that I'm having to do that for women. I've had to write a book to stand up for half of the bloody human race here. And it didn't feel very nice either. I don't like listening to people giving sexist definitions of women. Trans people are not the only people who can feel insulted and belittled in this. I do too. So that said, I can understand why any particular trans person doesn't want to do it. But yes, there is no situation where one side in an entrenched battle just wins by trampling the other side to pieces or silencing them completely. That just doesn't happen. So yes, we do need to discuss. And the end of the book, the very last section of it, I talk a bit about what would a way forward look like. And I can only give sort of broad principles, but I'm actually very interested in the theory of negotiations, because there's just this fantastic body of work on negotiations, looking at what people did in Northern Ireland or in Colombia or in hostage negotiations, where you've got people who have completely different interests and starting points, and yet somehow they manage to get to a point that they reach some sort of agreement on some very thorny issue. And I mean, I can't go into detail here, but the one thing that I would say is that people need to step away from their positions and start thinking about their interests. So your position is your worked out, formulated idea of what you think the world should be like. There should be a United Ireland, or Northern Ireland should always stay part of the United Kingdom, or, they should give me £1 million before I hand over this hostage. That's your position. Your interests are what actually you need or want. And those may not be the same as your positions. You may think they are, but they're not. And the negotiation starts when each side steps back from its position. So I think the obvious positions here are trans women are women and trans women are men. And no matter how much you believe one of those two things to be true, you actually do have to step away from it and think, what do I need here? What do I want here? What has to happen? So for me, there have to be female-only spaces where females need them and want them. That's just non-negotiable. They really have to stop sterilising children, putting children on the pathway to sterilisation. And that's basically it. I don't care what people call themselves. I can see people, I knew they would, I can see people going, no compromise. They're men. Fine. You can still say that all you like, but you're not going to get anywhere. Think about why you need to say that. You need to say that because women need to be in female-only spaces in certain circumstances. People need to be able to talk without apology about their bodies and so on. Think about your interests. I know some of you won't do that, but I'm hoping that some of you will. And if we do, at some point, some trans people or some trans activists will too. And then we can start to talk, for goodness sake.
Great, I'm going to give you some questions now. So I'm just slightly peering at my over my glasses. I'll try and get through as many as I can. So does your maths background inform your method of analysing trans ideology?
I think that the thing that it did was it gave me the confidence at first to think this doesn't make any sense. I mean, honestly, we all know this. There's nothing very complicated here. There are two sexes. People can't change sex. It hasn't happened for mammals for 200 million plus years. So you don't need to have a PhD in mathematics to do that. But it's incredibly helpful to be able to say, but I do have a PhD in mathematics. There can't be something I'm missing here on this basic bit of logic. So I'd say that was the main thing, just that, I had confidence in myself.
Yeah. And there's an interesting question here about the court cases that are various court cases that have been brought mostly by women in the UK. Do you think that through the courts is going to be the most effective way for gender critical feminists to sort of win some victories, I suppose?
In this country, for sure, because the law is actually quite good. And the Equality Act does lay out quite clearly that male and female are real, and that that's what man and woman mean, and that gender reassignment does not change your sex. Those things have been honoured in the breach rather than the observance in the past 10 years, but that is the law. And as long as you can explain yourself properly and get a really, really good QC who knows what they're doing, you can make some real headway there. All of that said, the Equality Act in particular is, as they say, permissive rather than prescriptive. I think that's the right. Yeah, I think that's what they say. So you can have women-only spaces. You don't have to have women-only spaces. So that, for example, is what happened with the prisons judicial review. The judge said, yes, gosh, it must be awful for those women being locked up with rapists. I can totally understand they must be terrified and it must be awful. But you know what? The law doesn't make the government take that into consideration. It just says the government can consider women's dignity and privacy and safety if it wants to. Apparently it doesn't want to. That's not unlawful. So there's still work to do even on the law.
And do you think that, how long do you think it will take before medical negligence cases come to court from transitioners who do seem to be increasingly vocal in some spaces anyway?
So since the last major medical scandal in America, which was in the 1990s with the recovered memory syndrome, and which went on into the 2000s, the pharma and hospital and medical generally lobby in America has made a lot of changes to the law. Like they've managed to get a lot of statutes of limitations, caps on the damages that can be paid out, very short time periods that you can take complaints with, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be much, much harder. There are still a few states in America where there are uncapped damages, and I'm reliably informed that there are lawyers looking for the slam dunk case, the case that they can take and get, tens or hundreds of millions, because that's what you have to do. Because that's what happened with the recovered memory syndrome, by the way. Like there's just, literally hundreds of thousands of people's lives were destroyed by doctors, basically creating multiple personalities in them and then medicating them. And it stopped when court cases put negligence, put liability on medical practitioners, and then the insurers stop paying for it. So that's why it will stop in America, is if the insurers stop paying for it. But it's going to be much harder this time around, because these guys are the biggest lobbyists. These are the people who spend their money on getting the laws the way they like.
And there's a question, I'm slightly paraphrasing and sort of collapsing the questions together because there's lots of good ones. Thanks so much for sending them in. Do you think that balancing gender critical belief against trans belief, I guess thinking of the Maya Forstater case, that that both beliefs are protected, is a useful way of pursuing this?
I do, and I know I've heard a lot of people say, what Maya believes isn't a belief; it's the truth. And I think that's to misunderstand things in a few ways. One is your belief can be in the truth, but the other one is that Maya's belief is more than just that there are only two sexes. It's that there are only two sexes, and that is consequential, in particular for women. And you could believe that there are two sexes. Lots of men believe that, but they think it doesn't matter, and that the women are just, I don't know, not as good as men or something like that. Each individual woman is just rubbish if she's not getting anywhere. So that's a package. That is actually a belief system. It's a sort of a potted definition of feminism, and that is her belief, and that is now a protected belief. I think the other thing that they miss is that when belief is protected, automatically so is lack of belief. So there was a separate strand of argument in Maya's cases, which was that the gender identity ideology was the belief, and that she recused herself from it. She was in effect a gender atheist, and both of those won. So it's quite important now. It's really settled law now that in the workplace you can say, but I don't believe any of this stuff. You don't have to go on and say, and by the way, I have a belief in the importance of biological sex, especially for women. You can just say, I just don't believe any of that stuff. It's not my thing. That's how I feel. That's what I want to do. I just want to go non-binary. What do you mean by that? That's my current workplace stance.
And someone is saying it's their impression that there are many more male to female trans people than female to male. If that is correct, and I don't know if it is, could you give a reason?
So in the book, I talk about the different reasons that people identify out of their sex, and they're completely different for men and for women. And they're not all the same, even for all the men who do it or all the women who do it. Historically speaking, nearly everybody who identified out of their sex has been a man, as in they're men who identify as women. It's generally not possible for the subordinate group to identify out of their group. A woman can't just go, do you know what? I don't identify as somebody who doesn't inherit the land. I don't identify as someone who can be married off. I don't identify as someone who can't vote. So subordinate groups have never been allowed to identify out. So males, the privileged group, are the only ones who've been given that privilege. Why they do it, I mean, some of them are like the Fa'afafine. They are effeminate gay men who find it very hard to be accepted or to accept themselves as men. Life has been easier as a woman. There's this thing called autogynephilia, and I can see what time it is, so let's not go into that. People can read about it in the book. And that was nearly all of them until relatively recently. And then very recently, the phenomenon of young female transitioners has absolutely exploded. And that's a group who are doing something that is more analogous to eating disorders or self-harm. They're expressing their distress at a world in which, it's really not very good for girls still. In fact, I think in some ways it's worse than when I was younger. It's more gendered. And this is the solution that they have latched onto. So I know some teenage girls, and somebody was showing me a chat between some of them recently on a WhatsApp group. And I think it was 4 kids were in it, 4 or 5 kids, and 2 of them are girls who identify as non-binary. And they were talking about a visitor to one of their houses who was transphobic. And this girl, this NB, she'd gone and hidden in the toilet, and she was WhatsApping her friends, and she was saying, oh God, this is awful, this is so embarrassing, what am I going to do, why are older women such bigots? And the other one said, oh, yuck, turfs, stitch their mouth closed. And then the other one typed back, stitch a bitch. And these are girls of 15 who don't identify as girls. Well, if that's what you think older women are, would you identify as girls either? The self-hatred is incredible.
So I've got 2 more questions that I'm going to ask you together, and then I guess we're nearly at the end. So one is this: I'm a 60-year-old feminist teaching young women in their 20s at university. To me, they're all being gaslighted into accepting having hard-won rights taken away, but they don't protest and they won't enter debate. What can I do to wake them up? And the second question, so that's about how to talk to younger women. And the second one, which just seemed to me a bit similar. What can a woman like me, left-wing progressive, do about the terrible sense of betrayal I feel when I realise how many left-wing men who until now I have so admired are keeping quiet on this issue?
So they're two hard questions. Yeah. I don't have any shortcuts to talking to younger women. I haven't managed to do it very successfully myself. All I can say is that we all do. What the parenting advice that you're given when parents are small is that, or when children are small, is that the way you behave is more influential to your children in how you model rather than how you say. So if you are relentlessly calm, honest, fact-based, etc., that doesn't go unnoticed. And people have got in touch with me and said, I'm really looking forward to your book, people I thought were just absolutely in the camp of, I have to work with her, but she's a bigot. So I guess people make their decisions themselves quietly by looking around them, and you want them to see something that they would think is admirable when they look at you. And that doesn't mean you have to be a saint, it just means you have to be consistent and honest. On the men and the betrayal, I try not to have feelings about a lot of all of this, in the sense that I don't think those feelings help or change the progress of things. I think there's a certain amount of harm that's going to come, a very large amount of harm from this movement, in particular to children, to women, especially vulnerable women like women in jail. And the reason I wrote the book was to try to do my bit to minimize that harm. I can't stop it, I can't change it, I can't make other people do things, I can't make them feel the way I think they should or think the way that they should. All I can do is what I think. The only person I can influence is myself. I mean, those men weren't what you thought they were. Yeah, they weren't what I thought they were either. I mean, we have to move on. We are. I mean, we here on this call, we are. So I would just drop them by the side of the road and walk on.
Do you want two more questions before we stop?
I'm fine with that.
I can keep going for hours.
People can hang up if they want.
Yes, that's true. Okay. So somebody's asking if you've got any pushback at your work or anywhere else. And I'm also interested to know whether you are nervous and apprehensive about publishing a book on, on what is undeniably a controversial subject. And then somebody else is asking, what's the most shocking thing you found out while doing your research?
So work has been great. I don't write about this issue at work. I am the Britain editor of The Economist. Until relatively recently, I did events for The Economist, and before that I was the finance editor. It's quite separate, but our editor is a free speech absolutist, and that carries us through. If people want to come and talk to me at work, they can, and some of them have. So, that's the short answer there. Sorry, what was the second one? On what am I afraid? Courage and fear. I mean, I've probably said this too many times before, but it was really going to the D-Trans Advocacy Network meeting in 2019 that got me over the hump from thinking I should write this book to I will write this book. And that was quite a moving experience, because there were these kids, all of them young gay kids, and I care a lot about young gay kids. I have gay kids in my family, and they're not the only kids who matter, and they're not the only kids this is affecting, but it matters to me a lot, And I saw these kids have been sterilized, and it was just the most horrifying thing. I had no idea that such a thing could happen, and that got me over the hump of thinking I should write this book, but what, will it blow up my life? Will it ruin everything? Am I the right person? What will the impact be? Will people not be my friend? Whatever. And there was no thinking about any of that anymore. So that's what I was trying to get at when I said, I try not to think about other people's reactions or actions. I just do my thing and drop them by the side of the road. Like, it's just easier when you know what you should be doing. So I knew what I should be doing, so then it didn't matter. That was the Audre Lorde quote, it matters less and less whether I'm afraid. It's just not relevant, So that helps. Was there another question? Was there another last bit?
What was the most shocking thing you found out?
Oh God, no, this is impossible. This is simply impossible. Every day I am just piqued again, every day. I just look and think, what? You know, there's a rainbow butt monkey with a dildo in the library. You know, that was yesterday's horror. And I'm not making this up in case anyone hasn't seen this. That's literally what there was in Redbridge Library reading to kids. Every day there's another mad thing. Every day. And you keep expecting that people will stop and shout and say, no, it's all right. It's the Truman Show. It's all right. We aren't really pretending that it's all right to put men in women's prisons or women's sports or whatever. I can't pick out one thing. I just can't.
And perhaps this is a good question to end on. There's really lots more. So thanks everyone. And I'm sorry if I haven't got to your question. If you knew somebody that you loved and respected who strongly held gender identity beliefs, what do you think would be the best way to broach the subject and get a discussion going?
So I do love and respect people who hold gender identity beliefs, and I don't feel arrogant enough that I would say that what's the best way for me to broach the subject and get a discussion going. I feel that there's a starting position there that I'm this, you know, pangendrum who knows everything and they're the fool who hasn't given this any thought. You know what, a bit of intellectual humility is necessary too. If they want to talk, they know that they can talk. I mean, anyone who knows me knows that I'm not a bigot and I'm not scary, and you know, and also they don't have to talk to me, they can just read the book now. Isn't that nice? So I wouldn't look at it that way. If you know and love somebody who has gender identity ideas, you could ask them questions. Come on, they're going to have things to teach you too. And if you, I mean, this is a poignant question for some parents, I know. I don't really have any great advice on that one, but you know, one thing that you can do with kids in general when you're in very conflictual situations is promise a question each, take turns. Say, you know, I'd love to talk to you about this. It's kind of embarrassing. We're skating around this issue. Let's take turns to tell each other something. You tell me something that you think is really important. You go first. Tell me something you think I don't understand. And really, really, really listen. You know, don't start from the viewpoint that you've got it worked out and they haven't. You know, they think that too.
Thanks so much, Helen. And thanks everyone for listening and also for joining in. I wish we were in a room together. I'm a big fan of live rather than online, but soon.
I'm just
going to show you the book one more time. Here it is, very elegant. Thank you to...
Can I say one thing before we finish, Susanna, because I know you've got to say some thanks. I have two people I really need to say thank you to, and I don't say thank you to them often enough. And they are my wonderful agent, Caroline Hardman, and my wonderful editor, Cecilia Stein, both of whom are here tonight. And without either of them, this book wouldn't have been written. And in particular, without Cecilia being quite an irritating person, it wouldn't be a good book. She was the person who told me everything I've got wrong.
Well, thank you, Helen, as well. And congratulations on your book. And thank you to Women's Place UK for hosting this event and inviting me to talk to Helen.
And thank you, Susanna. I really enjoyed talking to you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it too.
All right.